The crunch of snow under heavy boots echoed through the dense taiga as Nikolai stumbled deeper into the wilderness. His breath came in ragged bursts, visible in the icy air. Behind him, faint voices carried on the wind, a cruel reminder that his pursuers were still close. He gripped the strap of his backpack tighter, its meager contents slapping against his side with every desperate step. The forest loomed tall and unyielding, the towering pines casting long shadows that seemed to shift and twist with the waning light. Nikolai paused briefly, his heart hammering against his ribcage, as he scanned the undergrowth for signs of movement. Nothing but the eerie stillness of the taiga greeted him. Yet he knew better than to trust it. Once a decorated officer, Nikolai's life had unraveled in the span of months. Mounting debts had spiraled out of control, forcing him to make desperate choices. Now, the thugs sent to collect their due weren't interested in negotiations. They wanted blood. His only escape had been here, into the heart of the wilderness, where the rules of man no longer applied. The temperature dropped as twilight descended, and Nikolai knew he needed to find shelter soon. His military training had taught him to endure harsh conditions, but even he wasn't immune to the unforgiving grip of the taiga's winter. He pressed on, the weight of exhaustion pulling at his every step. Then he saw it, a wisp of smoke curling into the sky. His heart leaped at the sight, though caution tempered his hope. Smoke meant fire, and fire meant people. But whether they were friend or foe was an open question. Nikolai approached the source carefully, keeping to the shadows until he reached a clearing. There, nestled against a rocky outcrop, stood a modest log cabin. A dim light glowed from its single window, and the smell of wood smoke and cured meat lingered in the air. He hesitated, weighing his options. Staying outside was a death sentence, but knocking on the door could invite a different kind of danger. Before he could decide, the door creaked open, and a figure stepped out. The man was tall and wiry, his beard streaked with gray and his eyes sharp as a predator's. He carried a rifle slung casually over one shoulder, but his posture was anything but casual. The huntsman's gaze swept the clearing, landing squarely on Nikolai. "You're a long way from safety, stranger," the man said, his voice rough but not unkind. "What's your business here?" Nikolai raised his hands slowly, signaling he meant no harm. "I need shelter," he said, his voice hoarse from the cold and exertion. "Just for the night. I'll be gone by morning." The huntsman studied him for a long moment, then gestured toward the cabin with a tilt of his head. "Inside. And keep your hands where I can see them." Relief flooded Nikolai as he stepped into the warmth of the cabin. The interior was sparse but functional, with a wood-burning stove, a cot, and shelves lined with jars of preserved food. A fur blanket lay folded neatly by the fire, and the smell of pine sap mingled with the smoky air. The huntsman shut the door behind him and leaned his rifle against the wall. "Name's Jaeger," he said, motioning for Nikolai to sit. "You don't look like you're out here for a hunting trip." Nikolai hesitated, then nodded. "I'm running from trouble. Bad people. They'll kill me if they catch me." Jaeger's expression remained unreadable as he stirred a pot hanging over the fire. "The taiga doesn't care about your past," he said after a pause. "If you want to survive here, you'll need more than luck." As Nikolai warmed his hands by the fire, he noticed movement in the corner of the room. A small bear cub padded into view, its fur a rich brown and its curious eyes fixed on him. The sight was so unexpected that Nikolai blinked, unsure if exhaustion was playing tricks on him. "That's Pacom," Jaeger said, his tone softening. "Found him orphaned last spring. He's part of this place now, just like I am." The cub sniffed the air and trotted closer, its playful demeanor at odds with the rugged surroundings. Nikolai extended a tentative hand, and Pacom nuzzled it briefly before retreating. Jaeger watched the interaction, his eyes narrowing slightly. "The taiga has its own way of sorting things," he said cryptically. "If you're meant to stay, you'll find your place. If not, it'll spit you out." Nikolai wasn't sure how to respond, but one thing was clear: his journey had just begun, and the taiga's trials were far from over. The days in the taiga passed slowly, each one blending into the next with a rhythm dictated by survival. Nikolai, still wary of the huntsman Jaeger, found himself drawn into the routines of life in the wilderness. It was a world unlike anything he had known, unforgiving but oddly calming. Pacom, the bear cub, was a constant presence. The small creature seemed to have an innate curiosity about Nikolai, following him around the cabin and occasionally pawing at his boots. At first, Nikolai kept his distance, unsure of how to interact with the cub. But over time, the two developed an understanding. One evening, as Nikolai sat by the fire cleaning a snare under Jaeger's watchful eye, Pacom padded over and rested his head on Nikolai's lap. The gesture, simple and unassuming, stirred something in him, a flicker of warmth he hadn't felt in years. "He's chosen you," Jaeger said from across the room, his voice gruff but tinged with amusement. "Pacom doesn't trust easily. You must have done something right." Nikolai glanced at the cub and smiled faintly. "I'm not sure what that could be. I'm just trying to stay alive. The taiga sees things in people that they don't see in themselves," Jaeger replied cryptically. "Stick around long enough, and you'll understand." As the weeks passed, Jaeger began teaching Nikolai the skills needed to survive in the wilderness. Setting traps, tracking animals, reading the subtle signs of the forest. These were lessons Jaeger imparted with the precision of a master and the patience of a teacher. Pacom often joined them, bounding through the snow and occasionally disrupting their work with his playful antics. For Nikolai, these moments of levity were a welcome distraction from the weight of his past. One frigid morning, Jaeger led Nikolai to a frozen river. "You'll need to learn this," he said, handing Nikolai a spear tipped with a sharpened piece of iron. "If you're ever alone out here, fishing through the ice can mean the difference between life and death." Nikolai knelt by the hole Jaeger had cut into the ice, gripping the spear tightly. Hours passed as he watched the dark water below, his breath freezing in the air. Just as his patience began to waver, a flicker of movement caught his eye. He struck quickly, pulling a wriggling fish from the icy depths. The triumph was small but profound, a reminder that he could endure even in the harshest conditions. But the taiga wasn't without its dangers. One evening, as the trio returned from checking traps, a low growl echoed through the trees. Jaeger stopped abruptly, his hand shooting up in a silent signal for Nikolai to freeze. Pacom, sensing the tension, pressed against Nikolai's leg, his small body trembling. "Wolves," Jaeger muttered, his eyes scanning the shadows. "Stay close and don't make a sound." The growling intensified, and the outlines of several wolves emerged from the darkness, their eyes gleaming with predatory intent. Jaeger raised his rifle, but before he could fire, one of the wolves lunged. Nikolai reacted instinctively, stepping forward to shield Pacom and swinging a heavy branch he had picked up earlier. The impact sent the wolf sprawling, buying Jaeger enough time to fire a warning shot into the air. The sound echoed through the forest, and the pack retreated, their howls fading into the distance. "You've got guts," Jaeger said as they hurried back to the cabin. "But don't think for a second that the taiga's done testing you." That night, as Pacom curled up beside him, Nikolai replayed the encounter in his mind. The adrenaline had masked his fear in the moment, but now it lingered, gnawing at the edges of his thoughts. The taiga was a place of beauty, but it was also a place of relentless challenge. The next morning, as he ventured out to collect firewood, Nikolai noticed something that sent a chill down his spine. Deep in the snow, partially obscured by a fresh dusting, were boot prints, too large and too deliberate to belong to Jaeger. He crouched down, studying them closely, and his heart sank. They were recent, and they led straight toward the cabin. Nikolai's mind raced. The thugs hadn't given up. They had found him. Clutching the axe he had brought for the firewood, Nikolai hurried back to the cabin, his eyes scanning the treeline for any sign of movement. The fragile sanctuary he had begun to build felt as though it were on the verge of shattering. Inside, Jaeger looked up from sharpening his knife, his expression darkening as Nikolai explained what he had seen. "If they're here, they won't stop until they've taken what they came for," Jaeger said grimly. "We'll need to be ready." As the fire crackled in the hearth that evening, Nikolai sat in silence, his hand resting on Pacom's soft fur. The cub stirred in his sleep, oblivious to the storm brewing around them. For the first time since arriving in the taiga, Nikolai felt the true weight of the danger that stalked him. And for the first time, he wondered if he was strong enough to face it. The cabin was silent, save for the occasional crackle of the fire. Nikolai sat at the edge of his cot, sharpening a blade with methodical precision. Outside, the taiga stood still, cloaked in the heavy quiet of a winter night. Yet unease gnawed at him. The boot prints he'd found earlier that day lingered in his mind like a shadow, impossible to ignore. Jaeger had gone to check the traps, leaving Nikolai alone with Pacom. The bear cub lay curled up near the hearth, his soft snores the only comforting sound in the room. Nikolai couldn't shake the feeling that danger was closer than ever. His instincts, honed through years of military training, screamed at him to stay alert. His fears were confirmed the next morning. As he stepped outside to gather water from the frozen stream, he spotted something hanging from a low branch. It was a crude warning, a piece of cloth, torn and blood-stained, dangling like a macabre flag. Beneath it, footprints crisscrossed the snow, circling the cabin. The thugs weren't just tracking him. They were taunting him. "They're close," Jaeger said grimly when Nikolai showed him the discovery. The huntsman's eyes were sharp, his movements deliberate as he checked his rifle. "Too close. We need to move." But before they could act, the attack came. That evening, as darkness fell, the cabin was surrounded. Shadows moved among the trees, their silhouettes barely visible against the dim light of the fire inside. Nikolai's heart raced as he counted at least 3 figures, their low murmurs carried by the wind. The first blow came suddenly, a rock through the window, shattering glass and sending embers flying. "Get down!" Jaeger barked, shoving Nikolai toward the floor. Pacom growled, his fur bristling as the chaos erupted. The door burst open, and the thugs poured in, their faces obscured by scarves but their intentions unmistakable. A scuffle ensued, brutal and chaotic. Nikolai fought back with everything he had, but the numbers were against him. A blow to the side of his head sent him reeling, and the world blurred around him. He dimly heard Jaeger shouting, followed by the deafening crack of a rifle. Then darkness. When Nikolai regained consciousness, he was no longer in the cabin. Cold enveloped him, seeping into his bones as he realized he was lying in a shallow grave. His hands and feet were bound, and the earthy scent of freshly turned soil filled his nostrils. Panic surged as he struggled against the restraints, but the effort was futile. Above him, faint slivers of moonlight filtered through the dirt, a cruel reminder of how close he was to the surface, and yet so far. As his breath came in short, frantic gasps, something extraordinary happened. The cold receded, replaced by a strange warmth that spread through his body. The darkness around him shifted, giving way to a vivid vision. He saw the forest, not as it was, but as something alive, pulsating with energy. Trees whispered ancient secrets, their branches stretching like protective arms. Animals moved in perfect harmony, each step a part of a larger rhythm. Amidst this surreal scene, a voice emerged, soft but firm. "Endure, my boy. You are stronger than this." It was his grandmother, her presence as real as the earth pressing against him. He saw her standing beneath a great oak, her weathered face filled with quiet determination. "The taiga does not abandon those who respect it. Trust in it, and in yourself." The vision faded, but the warmth remained. Nikolai's panic subsided, replaced by a calm resolve. He focused on his breathing, conserving his strength, as he silently willed for a miracle. Far above, Pacom stirred. The bear cub had followed the trail left by the attackers, his keen senses leading him to the disturbed soil. He sniffed the ground, whining softly as he recognized Nikolai's scent. Then, with a determination uncharacteristic of his size, he began to dig. His small paws worked furiously, flinging dirt aside as he clawed his way toward the man who had become his protector. The night deepened, the forest alive with its usual sounds, the rustle of leaves, the distant call of an owl. But beneath it all, the frantic scraping of Pacom's claws carried a different urgency. The cub's instincts drove him forward, his efforts relentless. In the cold embrace of the grave, Nikolai felt the first trickle of soil shift above him. His heart surged with hope, the voice of his grandmother echoing in his mind. Endure. And so he did, as the taiga moved to save one of its own. Nikolai's senses flickered back to life as the weight of the soil shifted above him. The faint scraping of claws and the soft grunts of effort pierced the suffocating silence. Hope surged within him, fragile but insistent. He tried to move, but the bindings and the dirt held him in place, his breath shallow as he waited for salvation. Above, Packham's small but determined paws tore through the earth with relentless fervor. The cub's instincts had led him here, and now his bond with Nikolai propelled him forward. Each clawful of soil brought him closer, and soon, a sliver of light broke through the compacted dirt, landing on Nikolai's face. With a final push, Packham uncovered Nikolai's head. The man gasped for air, coughing as the cold night air rushed into his lungs. Tears welled in his eyes, not from the sting of dirt but from the overwhelming realization that he had been saved. Packham whimpered, nudging Nikolai's face with his snout, as if urging him to hold on. Moments later, heavy footsteps approached. Jaeger appeared, his rifle slung over his shoulder and a rope in hand. His sharp eyes took in the scene, a rare flicker of relief crossing his rugged features. "You've got a guardian angel," he muttered as he dropped to his knees to pull Nikolai out of the shallow grave. The extraction was grueling, but with Jaeger's strength and Packham's unwavering presence, Nikolai was finally free. They carried him back to the cabin, where Jaeger worked quickly to tend to his injuries. Bruises and shallow cuts lined Nikolai's body, but the deeper wounds were the ones that couldn't be seen. "You're lucky to be alive," Jaeger said as he wrapped a bandage around Nikolai's shoulder. His voice was steady, but his eyes betrayed a simmering anger. "Those men won't stop until you're dead. But they made one mistake." "What's that?" Nikolai rasped, his voice hoarse. Jaeger's gaze shifted to Packham, who sat by the door, his ears twitching at the slightest sound. "They underestimated the taiga." That night, while Nikolai rested, Packham's restless energy filled the cabin. The cub paced near the door, his instincts sharper than ever. Jaeger watched him closely, a plan forming in his mind. "Let him go," Jaeger said quietly, as if reading the animal's thoughts. "He knows what to do." At first light, Packham slipped out of the cabin, his movements silent and deliberate. The thugs had left a trail, their arrogance blinding them to the intelligence of the wilderness they sought to conquer. Packham followed their scent, his nose low to the ground, his body a blur of focused energy. The thugs were camped near the edge of the forest, laughing over their perceived victory. Their fire crackled, casting long shadows that danced ominously against the trees. They didn't notice the quiet padding of paws approaching from the darkness. Packham struck with the ferocity of the taiga itself. His roar shattered the stillness, sending the men into a frenzy of panic. The first thug barely had time to turn before Packham barreled into him, his claws raking across the man's chest. The second thug fired a shot into the air, but it only served to heighten the chaos. Packham's raw power and speed left them no chance to regroup. Within minutes the camp was in shambles, the thugs scattered and wounded, their bravado reduced to terror. Back at the cabin, Nikolai stirred, a sense of calm washing over him despite his pain. He didn't need to see the aftermath to know that justice had been served. When Packham returned hours later, his fur was matted with dirt and blood, but his eyes shone with triumph. The cub nudged Nikolai's hand gently, and Nikolai's gratitude was palpable as he whispered, "Good boy." In the days that followed, Nikolai's recovery was slow but steady. Jaeger continued to teach him the ways of the taiga, but something in Nikolai had changed. The wilderness no longer felt like a place of exile, it felt like home. The rhythm of the forest, the bond with Packham, and the brutal clarity of survival had awakened a part of him he hadn't known existed. One evening, as the three of them sat around the fire, Nikolai spoke softly. "I thought I came here to escape. But now I see this is where I was meant to be." Jaeger nodded, his expression unreadable. "The taiga doesn't take everyone," he said. "But it's taken you." Nikolai looked at Packham, who had grown visibly stronger, his presence a constant reminder of the loyalty and ferocity that nature could inspire. For the first time in years, Nikolai felt at peace. The forest wasn't just a refuge. It was his redemption. The days stretched into weeks as Nikolai began the slow process of healing. His bruises faded, the cuts along his arms and face scabbed over, and his strength returned bit by bit. Yet the wounds that ran deeper, those born of betrayal, fear, and loss, took longer to mend. The taiga had tested him, but it had also saved him, offering a second chance he never expected. Pakhom was his constant companion during this time. The bear cub seemed to sense Nikolai's fragility, staying close and offering his playful antics to lighten the man's burden. They shared a bond that went beyond words, one forged in survival and trust. As Nikolai worked to rebuild his strength, he often found himself marveling at Pakhom's growth. The cub had grown sturdier, his muscles filling out, his movements becoming more deliberate. It was clear that Pakhom, like Nikolai, was thriving in the taiga. Jaeger, ever the stoic guide, continued to share his wisdom. The taiga gives what you put into it, he told Nikolai one morning as they reinforced the cabin's roof against the creeping snow. It's not about conquering it. It's about learning to live alongside it. The words resonated deeply with Nikolai. He had spent so much of his life fighting, against others, against himself, against circumstances. But here, surrounded by the endless expanse of forest, he was learning to coexist. It was a lesson he hadn't realized he needed. One crisp afternoon, the fragile peace of the taiga was broken. Jaeger returned from checking his traps with a grim expression. "Poachers," he said simply, tossing a freshly dug trap onto the table. It was crude but effective, designed to maim rather than kill. "They're setting these all along the riverbank." Nikolai's jaw tightened. "What can we do?" Jaeger studied him for a moment before nodding. "We stop them." That night, armed with rifles and guided by moonlight, the two men set out to dismantle the traps and drive the poachers away. Pakhom followed, his growing presence a silent reminder of what was at stake. They moved through the forest with practiced stealth, disabling the traps and erasing the poachers' marks. The confrontation, when it came, was brief but intense. Jaeger's warning shots startled the poachers, who fired back in panic before retreating into the darkness. The taiga swallowed them whole, its dense undergrowth making escape their only option. When it was over, Nikolai felt a surge of pride, not for the violence, but for standing up to protect the place that had given him so much. As the days passed, the forest seemed to recognize their efforts. Wildlife that had once been wary of the cabin began to venture closer. A doe and her fawn grazed near the clearing. A red fox darted past, its coat gleaming in the sunlight. Even the wind seemed gentler, carrying with it a sense of quiet approval. Nikolai felt, for the first time, that he was a part of something greater than himself. One night, as Nikolai drifted to sleep by the fire, he was visited by a dream unlike any he had ever known. He stood in a radiant forest, its trees glowing softly as if lit from within. The air was warm, filled with the hum of life, birds singing, leaves rustling, water trickling over stones. He walked through the forest, his footsteps leaving shimmering ripples in the ground, as though his presence shaped the very fabric of the world. Ahead, he saw Pakhom, no longer a cub but a towering bear, his fur shining like burnished gold. Beside him stood Jaeger, younger and unburdened, his face serene. And beyond them, shadows of others, figures Nikolai couldn't quite place but felt connected to. His grandmother's voice echoed softly, carrying the wisdom of generations. "What you do here will last far beyond you. This is your legacy." When he awoke, the fire had burned low, its embers glowing faintly. Pakhom lay curled beside him, his breathing steady. Nikolai stared at the cub for a long time, the dream's meaning settling deep within him. The following morning, Nikolai made his decision. As Jaeger worked on repairing a fishing net, Nikolai approached him. "I'm staying," he said simply. Jaeger didn't look up but nodded once. "The taiga needs people who respect it. And it seems it's chosen you." Nikolai smiled faintly, a sense of peace washing over him. He had come to the taiga to escape, but now he knew it was where he belonged. The forest had tested him, healed him, and given him a purpose. And for that, he would honor it, with his life, his actions, and his loyalty. The forest was quiet that morning, bathed in the soft glow of dawn. Nikolai stood at the edge of the clearing, a small wooden box clutched tightly in his hands. Inside was a collection of items that had once defined his life: a military medal tarnished with age, a photograph of his family, and a crumpled receipt for the debts that had brought him to ruin. These tokens of his past weighed heavily, but today he intended to let them go. Pacom sat nearby, watching intently. The bear had grown into a formidable presence, his playful demeanor tempered by a quiet strength. Jaeger stood a few paces away, leaning on his rifle, his expression unreadable. He had said little when Nikolai announced his plan to bury the box, but his presence here spoke volumes. Nikolai took a deep breath and stepped forward, kneeling at the base of an ancient pine tree. The ground was soft from recent rain, yielding easily to the small spade he carried. Each shovelful of earth felt symbolic, as if he were digging not just into the ground but into the layers of his own soul. When the hole was deep enough, he placed the box inside, its weight sinking into the soil with a finality that sent a shiver through him. "Goodbye," he whispered, his voice barely audible. He filled the hole slowly, patting the earth down firmly before standing. The act felt less like an ending and more like a beginning, a way to leave behind the burdens that had chased him into the taiga. As he stepped back, Jaeger approached, his sharp eyes softened by something that resembled pride. "You've done more than survive here," the huntsman said. "You've earned your place. The taiga doesn't take everyone, but it's taken you." Nikolai turned to him, gratitude welling in his chest. "I wouldn't have made it without you. Without Pacom." He looked at the bear, who tilted his head as if understanding the sentiment. "You both saved me in every way that matters." Jaeger grunted, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "The taiga has its own way of sorting things out. You just have to listen." They walked back to the cabin in companionable silence. The forest seemed alive around them, its harmony palpable in the rustling of leaves, the chatter of birds, and the distant howl of a wolf. Nikolai felt a deep sense of belonging, as though the rhythm of the taiga had woven itself into his very being. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Nikolai stood outside the cabin, watching the forest shift into its nighttime symphony. The stars began to emerge, glittering like scattered jewels across the darkening sky. Pacom lay at his feet, his massive form a reassuring presence. Nikolai's mind drifted to the dream he'd had weeks ago, the radiant forest, the ripples of his actions stretching far beyond him. He understood now that the taiga wasn't just a place. It was a force, one that demanded respect and rewarded those who embraced its laws. It had transformed him, stripped him down to his essence, and rebuilt him stronger. He glanced at the cabin, where Jaeger's silhouette moved against the glow of the firelight. The huntsman had become more than a guide. He was a friend, a mentor, and a reflection of the life Nikolai now chose to lead. As the night deepened, Nikolai felt a quiet satisfaction settle over him. He had let go of his past, but he hadn't lost it. The lessons, the pain, and the growth were all part of who he was now. And for the first time in years he felt whole. Just as he turned to go inside, something caught his eye. Across the clearing, at the edge of the trees, a figure stood shrouded in shadow. It was too distant to make out any details, but its presence was unmistakable. Nikolai froze, his heart quickening. The figure didn't move, its outline blending with the forest's dark embrace. He stared for a long moment, a dozen questions racing through his mind. Was it a remnant of his past, come to haunt him? A guardian of the taiga, watching over him? Or simply a trick of the light, a figment conjured by the ever-mysterious forest? The figure turned and disappeared into the shadows, leaving Nikolai standing alone in the clearing. He exhaled slowly, a faint smile forming as he glanced down at Pacom. "The taiga always keeps its secrets," he murmured. With that, he stepped inside the cabin, the warmth of the fire welcoming him home. Outside, the forest hummed with life, its mysteries intact, its balance restored.